Hello, tiny people. I'm going to be talking to you today about slavery, a very important subject and obviously the prime reason for the American Civil War. Now, you might have thought I was kidding the other day when I asked you to get your room ready for this particular conversation, but I'm serious. If you haven't done it yet, I need you to stop this video. Go out, get some masking tape or some painter's tape. Get down on the floor with a ruler, a meter stick, some kind of measuring unit, and I need you to make a rectangle that is 5 feet long and 14 inches wide. Exactly. It's best if you can do this where it's going to be under a table or under a desk. If you put the thing down on the floor and then move the piece of furniture above you, that's fine. But don't give yourself a whole lot of room up above. I want it in a room that can be darkened. That is, it should be pretty close to really, really dark inside the room. So don't do this in the living room with the TV going or something. Someone responsible needs to be there to help, if at all possible. If you really can't get somebody, we can do this without, but I need you to be serious minded about this. Let's talk about slavery coming to America, not just the United States. Get that out of your head. This is America, the Americas, the two continents. Before the 1400s, slavery existed for the most part in the world inside of a culture. Think back to ancient times, this Greek slave market. Let's suppose there was a war between Athens and Sparta, and the Spartans won, and they might take slaves of Athenians. But those people really stayed inside their own culture. That is, they still spoke Greek. They sort of understood the politics. They definitely understood the religions, although they might have different primary gods. But they were inside a culture that they got. They were in an area that they understood, the flora, the fauna, and such. And this is really important. Before the 1400s, it was generally assumed that there would be a way for a slave to regain his freedom. After that war between Sparta and Athens, it could be that some of the Athenian people were taken as slaves for a period of a set number of years. But after the 1400s, after what's called the Columbian Exchange, when Columbus came over with the Europeans to the New World, slavery changed. Eventually, it ended up that the Europeans enslaved Africans. And when they took those African people from their home continent and brought them to other places throughout the world, they were pulled out of their cultures. They didn't have the same gods. They didn't have the same languages. They didn't have the same politics at all. And slavery after the 1400s became a permanent thing. Well, America had a labor shortage. And again, we're talking now primarily about the English colonies in North America. They needed workers. And the first thing they thought of was indenturing servants. That is, remember that an indentured servant is someone who agrees to work for a certain number of years in exchange for the cost of the voyage to America. So, an example I believe I gave was a young man whose father has lost the farm or has too many older brothers to even get a piece of land when the parent dies. Well, that person might have no other choice but to try somewhere else to gain a foothold, get a life for himself. And so he agrees to go over and work in the New World, thinking that's the land of opportunity. If I go out to the frontier there, perhaps I can get myself a farm again. But the chance down in the South of surviving being an indentured servant for that set number of years, all the way until a person had regained their freedom, was only 1 in 5. Only 20% of indentured servants in the South lived ever to be free again. Why? There were lots of diseases down there and back-breaking labor. So indentured servants didn't solve the labor problem. Stop and think about it. First of all, with the diseases and the labor, lots of them died. But also, if you take an English person and you make them an indenture and they run away, they really only have to go a few towns over before they're free. They can simply say they're a new arrival and they look like everyone else, It's just another white Englishman coming to live among us, and they could be accepted. So escape was fairly easy. Next, they tried Native Americans. Let's take the Indians and make them work for us. But those European diseases were deadly to the natives. They had no natural defenses against measles, smallpox, influenza, or a host of other European brought diseases. Now, think about escape for them. If you take a native out of the woods and force him to work on your farm, how far does he have to go to get back home? Just into the woods again. Now let's talk about Africans. And I need to be very clear on this point. Ladies and gentlemen, words have meanings. When I say Africans, I'm not talking about African Americans. I'm not talking about black people or brown people. I'm talking about Africans, people who are native to the continent of Africa. And remember, when you think about Giannis here, Giannis is not an African American. You can call him a black man. He is a black man. You may not call him an African American correctly because Giannis is not an American. He's Greek. Therefore, use the term African American would be silly. So when I say African slaves, I mean the peoples of Africa who had simply been captured, sometimes by other African people, sometimes by Europeans, although that was less frequently, and sold to the Europeans to go into slavery. Well, why did they pick on the Africans? There are a few obvious reasons. First of all, black people look different than white people. Now, when you think about that, you might say, well, that's just horrible. How can you even say that, Mr. Holman? And the answer is, I'm speaking to you honestly. It's not a question. Black and white look different. I'm not talking about the races, I'm talking about the colors. So that if an African escapes from slavery and runs 2 or 3 towns over, can he blend in with a bunch of white Englishmen? No. So race was one way to keep the people suppressed. Secondly, there was religion. I mean, could you, as a proper good Christian Englishman, go over to France or Spain or Holland and capture some of their people and bring them over to work in your fields in America? No, but these Africans who did not have the Christian religion, you could say you were saving their souls. And that was one of the arguments that Southerners used to say, very famously, there was a man named John Calhoun who said, slavery is a positive good for everyone involved, including the slaves. And one of his reasons was because they are given the Christian religion. Yes, we take advantage of their bodies, but we save their souls. There's also the consideration of power. When you think about the huge armies and navies of modern sophisticated European countries for that time, well, to go and grab the people of France, Britain would have to be willing to fight a huge and expensive war. But to go grab some Africans from their local little tribes that have no possibility of retaliating against you, that seems a little easier. And finally, we talked about that no way really to escape. All right, ladies and gentlemen, now's when I want you to get down on the floor underneath that piece of furniture into your taped off area. I hope before you do that, you'll make the room as dark as possible, but I want you to listen to me. And I want you to listen really with your ears and your mind open. Where you are now is in the hull of a slave ship. You're down below deck. There may be as many as 5 or 6 decks of slaves here. Now, the space you're given was in fact the space appropriated for carrying each slave from Africa to the New World, approximately 5 feet by 14 inches. The decks were laid low, like having that piece of furniture above your head. There was no way to stretch out and be comfortable. In the voyage across the ocean, there may be months, but there was no bathing. There was not much food. There was no exercise until the slaves were almost to the New World. And their bodies, through lack of use, the joints had stiffened up. They might have become a little weaker and paler. Their eyes might not work as crisply as they had before. So, as they neared the Americas, the slavers would bring the slaves a few at a time on deck, and they would throw salt water on them to clean them off. Now, you might say, well, that sounds kind of nasty. I mean, I imagine they have some sores from being locked up like that. And they would. And they would also have sores for other reasons because they didn't let them go to the bathroom. If you had to go, go. Imagine if you were on the lowest of 5 decks, how awful the conditions were. Barely enough oxygen to keep you alive in that fetid, stinking hold. Well, the slavers would bring the slaves up on deck and throw the ocean water on them, which was salt water, and that was probably a blessing because it would help them fight back the infection, and they would allow the slaves to move so that their joints began to work again. There was one thing you need to know about those slave ships as they crossed the ocean. It was the job of the slave ship captain to bring his product to market. Remember, they weren't treating these black people as people. They were treating them as chattel, as property, as possessions, like farm animals. And so as they crossed the ocean, if one of them became sick, the captain would order that that person be brought up on deck and simply thrown overboard because they couldn't afford to have a disease spread throughout all of the slaves on board the ship. It would be a financial mistake. And that's what they were thinking of when they were transporting these people. It was said that other ships could tell a slave ship when it passed by because they could see the sharks swimming behind it as it crossed the ocean. You can get back up now. Let's talk a little bit about how slaves were treated. There were some kind owners. Some of them even broke the law and taught their slaves how to read. But for the most part, an owner took care of a slave like a rancher would take care of cattle. That is, he fed it enough to get the work done. He would make sure that it was well enough to get the work done. They would give them enough clothes so that the women would not be embarrassed when a slave came by. But slaves were expensive. And the reason for any kind of good treatment was not the kindness of the human heart. The reason for any kind of treatment was dollars. It was economics. There were also slave owners who would whip slaves. That's actually what those are. That is a real man who really was a slave in the United States in the 1800s, and those are whip marks, scars left on his back. Now, down south, most of the people owned no slaves. 75%, 3 out of every 4 people didn't have any slaves. But they grew up in a slave culture, and they believed that it was the right of people to own slaves. Only 3% of the people had 20 or more slaves. So you see the pictures in the movies of the Southern colonel sitting out on his veranda, watching a 1,000 slaves out there picking his cotton. That was almost never a reality. And finally, I remind you again that ownership and slavery, it's not as simple as the northern guys were good and the southern guys were bad, or that the southern guys were immoral and the northern guys were moral, or that black people were good and white people were bad. This last little bit, I remind you again, according to the 1860 census, more than 1,500 African Americans owned more than 3,000 other African Americans. That was the economic system in the South. To get ahead, people used the system And there were some African Americans who were willing to do that. Why? Because they wanted what was best for themselves and their families, and that was the way to get ahead economically. So, yes, people made the jump to thinking of another person merely as a tool. But how to end slavery? That was the question. Of course, we know that it was slavery that really helped to divide the country and start this horrendous civil war that we're in the middle of studying. But tomorrow, I'm going to explain to you the first and biggest step in helping to end slavery. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please notice that Mrs. Canings gave us Monday, what was it, Monday the 5th off, and that therefore we will not be having the quiz that we had scheduled for them. Excuse me, it was Monday the 4th. We won't be having it. It has been moved to Tuesday the 5th of May. That will be quiz number 3. All right, tiny people, have a wonderful time. I hope you all got your grades. I did write a lot of comments in the Google Classroom when I did your quiz, but I think I had a little problem there, and I returned the quizzes instead of what I should have done, which was posting some of the comments. So I hope you got the comments. I hope you were able to see what I wrote inside each of your papers for the essays. For the regular quizzes, you just returned with the grade. If you haven't seen it yet, they are all posted in Net Classroom. Again, I had one question, the one that I messed up the English there and had a when I should have had a where or whatever it was. The story about the Generals Johnston, which battle they'd been hurt at or how many had been hurt in a battle. I just simply eliminated that question. It had been worth 3 points, so everybody who had that question wrong received 3 more points. Thank you, tiny people, and we will talk to you again soon.